to the Pentagon. And the toughest thing for me right now is I've got a 14-year-old daughter and a lot of her friends.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the two towers. A huge explosion now landing behind all of us.
I remember thinking it was the building I was in that was coming down. It was the loudest noise you ever heard in your life. The twisting metal. And
there are a lot of things that I would like to say and share with you. The very fact that we just had the memorial of the 9/11 terrorist attacks on our country, and realizing who the identity of Mystery Babylon the Great is, the mother of harlots, being Jerusalem and her people, recognizing the fact that there are those at work trying to set up for taking away the democracy of Israel, diminishing it, and changing the judicial system, because ultimately their goal is to set a king upon the throne that will be the anointed one. Their goal is to rule the world from Jerusalem and have the 70 nations representatives sitting in the Sanhedrin building that they intend to build, which I've seen the blueprints of with my own eyes. I've showed them to you. And to think of things that were said to the Turk, Adnan Oktar, by the same IDF soldier that said that shocking statement that I couldn't wrap my head around, basically, was that he was a soldier in the IDF, and he had made the comment that it was their job, the Israel people, to punish all the nations to where they had been scattered. And I thought, whoa, who gave you the authority to punish nations where you were scattered? And not all the nations and all the people had anything to do with you whatsoever. So I thought it was a really bold, crazy statement. And I thought, well, how on earth is Mystery Babylon going to eventually take total control and cause everyone to be under her rabbinical laws through the reestablished Sanhedrin Supreme Court, where they want to criminalize various people for having a Torah scroll, namely women at the Western Wall. They want to jail them if they pass that bill. They want to elevate themselves so that all the nations will come there. So that is the goal. That's what they're striving for. That's how they have seduced the certain nations that have signed on with the Sanhedrin to be accepting under their laws and rabbinical ideas. I want to revisit a story of 9/11 that was basically swept under the rug. And I want to tell you something that's absolutely shocking to me, that the Lord helped me to piece it together, and I want to share. So I want to tell this story again about the 5 Israelis that were filming the destruction of the Twin Towers and jumping up and down in glee and joy and excitement. I want to share what Benjamin Netanyahu said at the time of the Twin Towers collapse. And I want you to see that there were some people involved, high-ranking Jewish rabbinical people, people that have connections to Israel, people that have connections to the Mossad of Israel. And there are things involved in 9/11 that were definitely covered up. It's really hard to take as an American and see that kind of devastation of innocent people and no remorse, no regard for life, and it's astonishing to me. So I wanted to start off telling you that my mother had flown out to a Washington, D.C. airport days before the hijacked airplanes. When she was on her airplane, about, I don't know, maybe a week, 5 days before the attacks happened, she said that there was a Middle Eastern man that was looking all underneath the seats, looking around at the exits in the plane and checking out the plane, and it gave her a real uneasy feeling. But of course, we always prayed for God's protection every time she flies. Now, what really shocked me is I'd never heard anybody else have that experience until I was on Twitter one day, and it was a 9/11 anniversary, and I believe that it was the actor James Woods who said that he also, and he doesn't know my mom's story, but he said he was on a plane a few days before, and there was a Middle Eastern man looking for the exits, looking under the seats, and checking out his plane. The attacks happened. My mom was in D.C. and I was here in Colorado by myself. It was a really horrible situation. I woke up and everything was normal. It was super early in the morning here. And I went back to sleep for an hour, and when I woke up, the radio was saying, the tower just collapsed. The tower just collapsed. And I was like, what? What happened? I jumped out of bed, ran upstairs, flipped on the TV, and of course it was nonstop coverage for, you know, days straight. Nothing, no programming, anything but replaying, brainwashing the terrible events in New York and Pennsylvania. Finding out after my mother died that somebody else had this experience with a Middle Eastern man being on their plane, checking out the plane just a few days beforehand, was alarming to me. And my mom never had a verification from that person, you know, because she was already passed away. You know, not from the 9/11 events, but, you know, in 2018, she passed away of heart failure without knowing that this other person came forward having the same situation she had, and without knowing anyone else had it. I immediately called my mom in D.C., and, you know, it was very hard to get through because all the phone lines were tied up. And it was only a few days after that. I don't know if it was a week after that. It's hard to remember the timeline of when her travel plans were. But for a while, airliners were not allowed to take off or leave. And it was the strangest thing because we always have aircraft going over our home. And suddenly there was dead silence. So the strange thing about that is that, so it was only when they started allowing the flights to start up again later on, I think it was only a few days that my mom flew back to Colorado after the plane supposedly slammed into the Pentagon. Well, my mom, on the way to the airport in D.C., she had to travel past the Pentagon. And they were still, the scene was still fresh, okay? Let's put it that way. My mom said there was no plane parts, there was no plane in sight, there was nothing resembling a plane. There was just a big burn hole. The first few pictures you see of the Pentagon, even though they told us on TV that the plane went flying through and penetrated 3 rings of the Pentagon, when you actually see the aerial footage of the Pentagon, it only went into the first ring, whatever it was. And actually, when they showed the coverage, you can see white small structures down low where supposedly the plane would have flown right through that. So it's questionable what happened on 9/11, that's for sure. And you've got all of that investigation that went on. But I want to tell you some things that happened that was swept under the rug. And with the Lord revealing who Mystery Babylon is, and the fact that it says she is responsible for the souls of men, taking the lives of men, this further makes me question what really did happen. My question is, were those involved that were either Israelis or connected to Israel in some way working to bring this nation down that's been really good to them so that they could start the process of elevating themselves into the one world government, with the one world religion, with everyone being a representative of all the nations coming to speak when they become the world Supreme Court through their Sanhedrin revived, the very Sanhedrin that hates the gospel, that denies that Jesus came in the flesh, that denies that Jesus is the Messiah, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the King of Israel, that denies he's the Son of David and the Son of God. And this is the Antichrist spirit that's right there in Jerusalem. And their whole goal is to set themselves up to put that king on the throne that will rule over the entire world and enforce their rabbinical laws. Not just Torah laws, but these draconian laws that persecute women in particular. You have to remember, too, that Rabbi Schneerson, before he died, a lot of the rabbis thought he was the Messiah. But he told Benjamin Netanyahu that he would be handing the keys of the government to the Messiah, to the Anointed One. So we know that Netanyahu's going to have something to do with positioning this king to be sitting on the throne over Israel. So this is the cover-up story that you never really heard any more about. But I'm going to show you some connections and read this to you, because you need to know if the Scarlet Harlot, Mystery Babylon, is responsible for taking the souls of men. That's a very interesting statement in the book of Revelation. And this is an article by Mark H. Gaffney, and it's titled 9/11, the FBI Report and the Dancing Israelis Standing Truth on Its Ear. But it is a true story, and this is really what happened. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, a Jersey City, New Jersey housewife named Maria was making coffee in her kitchen when she received a phone call from a neighbor who excitedly told her to look out the window. When Maria looked out, she was shocked to see a plume of smoke rising from the World Trade Center about a mile away across the Hudson River. Quickly, Maria grabbed some binoculars and stepped out onto the balcony of her high-rise apartment, known as the Doric Towers, which afforded an excellent view of the lower Manhattan. Maria did not yet know that a commercial airliner had plowed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, but it was obvious that an ugly tragedy was in progress. As she watched, she noticed 3 men in the parking lot below who were behaving strangely. They were sitting or kneeling on the roof of a white paneled truck, and described as a van, and like her, were watching the stricken World Trade Center. Oddly, however, the 3 men were celebrating. They were smiling and laughing, giving high fives and taking photos, and one looked to be filming the World Trade Center as it burned. Their inappropriate behavior made Maria suspicious, and a few minutes later, when the men drove off in the van, she copied down their license plate number. When her husband returned home from jury duty, she discussed the matter with him, then called the police and reported what she had seen. At 3:31 p.m., the FBI put out a Be on the Lookout, which is BOLO, all points bulletin, and about an hour later, East Rutherford police officers Scott DiCarlo and Sergeant Dennis Ravelli identified the white van, then stopped it on Route 3 near Giant Stadium. The cops approached and instructed the occupants to exit the vehicle, but the driver refused, and the officers, now with guns drawn, had to physically remove the occupants. There were now 5 of them. The men were handcuffed, read their rights, and taken into custody. All of them were between 22 to 27 years of age. Their names were Sivan Kurtzberg, his brother Paul Kurtzberg, Yaron Shemuel, Oded Elner, and Omer Marman. The driver, Sivan Kurtzberg, reportedly told Officer DiCarlo, "We are Israeli. We are not your problem. Your problems are our problems. The Palestinians are the problem." Another occupant falsely said, "We were on the West Side Highway in New York City during the incident." So that was a lie. A search of the vehicle turned up several passports, cameras, rolls of film, a sock stuffed with $4,700 in cash, backpacks, notebooks, and according to the Bergen Record, maps of the city with certain places highlighted. It looked like that they were hooked in with this. It looked like they knew what was going to happen. This story in the local newspaper was prescient because the issue of foreknowledge would preoccupy the subsequent FBI investigation. The question was eventually answered, though, as we will learn, not by the FBI. The 5 Israelis claimed to be tourists temporarily employed by a local moving company, Urban Moving Systems, known as UMS, based in Weehawken, New Jersey. The owner of the business was also an Israeli, 31-year-old Dominique Suter, whom FBI agents briefly questioned before Suter fled to Israel with his family. At that point, the FBI obtained a warrant and searched the UMS premises. They found evidence of Suter's hasty departure, uneaten sandwiches, cell phones, and half-full coffee cups, as well as stored furniture and the belongings of numerous customers who had been left hanging. FBI agents seized documents and at least 15 computers. The FBI placed the 5 Israelis in a federal detention center, isolated them from one another, and began to interrogate them closely. The investigation was driven by numerous discrepancies in their accounts and by the men's strange behavior in the period before the second plane impact, when everyone still assumed that the first crash was simply a tragic accident. Some of the Israelis were given as many as 7 lie detector tests in an effort to determine if they had advanced knowledge of the 9/11 attacks. One, Paul Kurtzberg, refused for weeks to take the lie detection test and then agreed to take it and promptly failed it. During interrogation, the Israelis reportedly explained why they were happy that morning. They said it was because, quote, the United States would now have to commit itself to fighting Middle East terrorism, that Americans would have an understanding and empathy for Israel's circumstances, and that the attacks were ultimately, quote, a good thing for Israel. As we know, Likud leader Benjamin Netanyahu made a similar comment when asked about 9/11. He said, quote, it's very good, end quote, and Netanyahu told the press, then backtracked. Well, not very good, but it will generate immediate sympathy for Israel, he said. The FBI investigation took a serious turn when 2 of the men turned up in a U.S. national intelligence database, indicating they were known Mossad agents. Mossad is the Israeli equivalent of the CIA. Also, 2 of the men, it's not clear if these were the same 2, were found to be in possession of round-trip airline tickets. The 2 had arrived in the U.S. from Tel Aviv via Athens on June 15, 2001, and were scheduled to return to Israel on September 12, 2001, the day after the attacks. Was the suspicious timing of their planned departure just a coincidence? In March 2002, an unnamed high-ranking U.S. intelligence official told The Forward, a venerable New York Jewish newspaper, that the FBI concluded at the end of its investigation that the Israelis arrested in New Jersey had been conducting a Mossad surveillance mission on September 11th, and that their employer, Urban Moving Systems, served as a front. ABC News conducted its own probe and reported a similar view on the network's primetime show 2020. During a taped interview with co-hosts Barbara Walters and John Miller, the Israeli detainees' attorney, Steve Gordon, made a belated attempt at damage control. Gordon said his clients denied the news reports that they had been celebrating or rejoicing or even horsing around that morning. But Gordon's attempt to spin the story in a more favorable light remained at odds with the evidence found in the white van, namely rolls of film, plus the film pulled from 3 cameras, which, when developed by the FBI, appeared to confirm exactly what Maria first told police. The Israelis had taken portrait shots of one another with the burning World Trade Center in the background, and plainly were in a festive mood. The FBI never found the alleged video camera. However, ABC consultant Vince Canestraro, who formerly had served as CIA Chief of Counterterrorism Operations, later told journalist Christopher Ketchum that the question that most troubled FBI agents in the weeks and months after 9/11 was whether the Israelis had arrived at the site of their celebration with foreknowledge of the attack to come. According to Canestraro, from the beginning, the FBI investigation operated on the premise that the Israelis had foreknowledge. Such a conclusion is consistent with the FBI report on the case, or rather with the small part of it that was made public in 2011. Most of the FBI reports, some 1,280 pages or more in length, remains classified and will not be released until 2035. We should demand it be released now. But even from the lesser part that has been declassified, it is evident that the FBI uncovered some disturbing material linking the Israelis to 9/11, material that was never reported by the U.S. news media, controlled by BlackRock. Larry Fink, a Jewish man with ties to Israel, he was controlling the media. For instance, the report mentions that the FBI received information from its Miami office that one of the 19 alleged 9/11 hijackers had utilized another Israeli-run moving company, Classic International Movers, known as CIM, also based in New Jersey. It seems that a number of Israeli-owned moving companies were operating in the New York area, and curiously, CIM's telephone number turned up in one of the notebooks found in the white van, all of which prompted the FBI to detain and interview 4 CIM employees at this moving company. The 4 were Israelis and had served in the Israeli military, and all 4 had entered the U.S. from various locations in South America, although the outcome of the expanded investigation cannot be determined from the heavily censored FBI report. The connection to the 19 hijackers must have alarmed U.S. intelligence experts. If Mossad agents were shadowing Arab terrorists in the U.S., it possibly meant the Israelis had prior actionable intelligence about the 9/11 attacks, which they did not share with the U.S. officials. But here's the thing. If they were celebrating and joyful and saying that it was a good thing that it happened, they are involved in the terror plot. There can be no doubt. In another case, the FBI interviewed a former Urban Moving Systems employee who said he had quit Urban due to a high amount of anti-American sentiment present among Urban's employees. The former worker stated that, in addition to Israelis, UMS also employed Russians, Hungarians, and other foreign nationals. But the Israelis always spoke Hebrew among themselves and held frequent meetings in the company office, to which, he said, and the other non-Jewish employees were never invited. The man said that an Israeli employee of Urban had once remarked, quote, "Give us 20 years and we'll take over your media and destroy your country," end quote. I hasten to add, this is straight out of the FBI report. I am not making this up, nor embellishing it. The same individual also offered a glimpse into the moving operation that could explain why UMS owner Dominic Suter fled the country. The former employee called Suter a crook and described how he would have the delivery teams fill up the trucks with empty boxes because he, Suter, would charge the customers by cubic feet. Suter would also have some employees stay on the trucks when they were weighed so that he could charge more. If this is true and Suter was engaging in shady business practices, it might explain why he fled. Suter might have feared exposure and possible prosecution. But if they are involved in those towers coming down, that would be good reason to flee enough. In the Pentagon building, the testimony of the plainly disgruntled individual must be treated with skepticism. Yet one of the Israeli detainees, I will refer to him as the 5th Israeli, corroborated some of what he said. The 5th Israeli told the FBI that most of the foreign nationals employed at UMS lacked the necessary work visas, which means that Dominic Suter made a practice of hiring illegals, and based on the testimony of his own workers, It's clear he exploited their illegal status, paying substandard wages under the table while avoiding payroll taxes. Suter definitely had cause for concern. Yet, as the reader is about to learn, his flight was also undoubtedly motivated by a much more serious matter. In the end, despite considerable evidence to the contrary, the FBI concluded that the 5 Israelis most likely did not possess prior knowledge of the World Trade Center events. On November 20th, 2001, the detainees were served a deportation order for visa violations and then escorted from a U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Center in Brooklyn to JFK International Airport, where they were put on a flight to Tel Aviv. Once safely back in Israel, 3 of the men went on a national television show, and during the interview, one, Oded Elner, told his audience that, quote, "our purpose was to document the event," end quote, which of course implies foreknowledge. Elner's public admission reduced the FBI investigation to absurdity. Unfortunately, from there it gets worse because the rest of the story is almost too terrible to contemplate, yet face it we must. The 5th Israeli. It seems that one of the 5 Israeli detainees did not know enough to keep his mouth shut, probably because he was not a member of the core Mossad group, hence was not in the loop. And this 5th Israeli was apparently just a guy, a poor schmuck, who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, I highly doubt that, but according to the FBI report, the man broke down and sobbed repeatedly under interrogation, not what you would expect of a Mossad operative. The man told the FBI he barely knew the 4 other Israelis who were in the van with him at the time of the arrest, and did not even know the last names of these other men. Evidently, this 5th man was one of 2 Johnny-come-latelys who joined the group after the high-fivers left the parking lot below Maria's apartment. This odd man out gave the FBI the fullest account of any of the detainees. He described in considerable detail the events of that morning, how he first noticed smoke pouring from the World Trade Center while en route to work, and how he arrived at UMS late between 9:15 and 9:20 a.m., whereupon he reported to the box packaging area in the UMS warehouse for some scheduled training. Apparently, the man was still a novice mover. He further explained that around 11 a.m., one of the other Israelis came in and announced that they are taking down the 2nd building, at which point everyone in the warehouse hurried up to the roof to watch the mind-boggling spectacle. Did you catch those words? They are taking down the 2nd building. The 5th Israeli told the FBI that, and I quote, "At the time, he, the 5th man, believed that the authorities had purposely collapsed the building to prevent the additional damage that would be caused by the building tumbling to its side. It was not until later that night, when he saw a TV news report in jail, that he realized that the planes had caused the buildings to collapse." And this is verbatim from the FBI report. Looking back with unblinkered hindsight, it's clear that the naive 5th Israeli heard it right the first time from the other Israeli who knew the truth that the World Trade Center was being systematically demolished in plain view of the whole world. Today, when this article was written, it was 15 years after the fact, and now, we're well beyond that. We know it was a demolition thanks to the independent research of some highly motivated scientists, engineers, and truth-tellers who over the years have gathered an overwhelming amount of evidence proving beyond a reasonable doubt that explosives were used. The basics have been known since at least 2007, when the physicist Stephen E. Jones found explosive residue in the samples of World Trade Center dust. Some of the evidence for explosives was actually compiled on the morning of the attacks. Indeed, it was being gathered at Hoboken, New Jersey on the shore of the Hudson, even as the Israelis celebrated on the roof of the UMS warehouse a mile or more upriver at Weehawken. When Rick Siegel heard about the tragedy unfolding in Lower Manhattan, he hustled to the Hoboken waterfront, set up his video camera on a tripod, and began shooting. Over the next 2 hours, Siegel diligently filmed both collapses, but even more importantly, he captured an audio recording of the enormous rumbling explosions that ripped through the towers in the moments before they fell. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of shocked local residents who were also watching from the Jersey Shore that morning must have heard the same enormous explosions, as did many more in Lower Manhattan. Yet not one of these Americans was ever asked to appear before the official 9/11 investigations and described what he or she saw and heard that morning. Cover up. Siegel's audio videotape is almost as shocking on replay as the events of that day. The slightly muffled but now nonetheless unmistakable sounds of huge multiple blasts carried quite well for more than 2 miles across the open water of the Hudson River. Siegel's audio record is yet more corroborating evidence refuting the fiction that has pervaded the U.S. media ever since that plane impacts and fires brought down the Twin Towers. No way we were deceived. The official story about 9/11 is probably the most monstrous lie ever perpetrated upon the American people. The Mossad team based in Weehawken not only had, by its own admission, foreknowledge of the attacks, the testimony in the FBI's own report, as I have attempted to show, suggests that the Israelis also knew that very morning that the World Trade Center was being demolished with explosives. Oded Elner's brazen admission that, quote, our purpose was to document the incident, end quote, may have played well in Israel, but it raised a number of urgent questions for Americans, questions that still need answers. First and foremost, how did the FBI come to embarrass itself so badly? Indeed, how could the FBI have reached a conclusion 180 degrees from the truth? Especially since its investigation, judging from the portion of the FBI report that is available, appears to have been on track, at least initially. I suspect the answer is rather simple. Although the FBI had all the necessary resources to do its work, it was hamstrung by the official story, and thus was unable to pursue leads that would have led to the truth. The idea of a demolition was so far out of bounds as to be unthinkable. This no doubt also explains why the FBI declassified the 5th Israeli's eyewitness account. The FBI censor evidently failed to comprehend the significance of the man's testimony pointing to the use of explosives. But the FBI was also shut down from above. A source at ABC News told journalist Chris Ketchum that there was a lot of frustration inside the Bureau about this case. They feel the higher echelons torpedoed the investigation. Leads were not fully investigated. ABC reported that a settlement was finally reached in the case after high-level negotiations between Israeli and U.S. government officials. According to former CIA counterterrorism chief Vince Canestraro, there is no question but that it the order to close down the investigation came from the White House. It was immediately assumed at CIA headquarters that this basically was going to be a cover-up so that the Israelis would not be implicated in any way in 9/11. Bear in mind, this was a political issue, not a law enforcement or intelligence issue. The travesty I have just described incriminates then-President G.W. Bush and VP Dick Cheney. We are left to ponder their obvious treachery and the following incendiary question: how did the Mossad team in New Jersey know in real time that the Twin Towers were being demolished with explosives? And then the article lists these notes. This was widely reported by many different sources. One was Paulo Lima, 5 men detained as suspected conspirators from the Bergen County Record, or the Bergen Record, September 12th of 2001. ABC News reported on 2020 with Barbara Walters and John Miller on June 21st, 2002. Christopher Ketchum, what did Israel know in advance of the 9/11 attacks? Counterpunch, March 7th of 2007. James Bennett, Day of Terror, the Israelis' spilled blood is seen as bond that draws two nations closer, end quote, from New York Times, September 12th, 2001. Posted on the New York Times. FBI report, Section 1. Mark Perlman, discussion of the dancing Israelis, forward March 15th, 2001. ABC News 2020 with Barbara Walters and John Miller, June 21st, 2002. The matter of the video camera was never resolved. The FBI never found the video cam, but neither did it find reason to question the reliability of the witness Maria, who in repeated interviews never changed her story. In fact, Maria gave a very detailed description of what she saw. She described the video cam as a small handheld unit with a liquid crystal display and LCD screen. She also recalled that one of the men was holding it up to his face, moving the camera slowly from side to side, or as she put it, panning the area. In the FBI report, Section 1. Christopher Ketchum was interviewed. What did Israel know in advance of the 9/11 attacks? That was the counterpunch in March 7th, 2007. The declassified FBI report about the 5 dancing Israelis may be downloaded, and they give a link to that. And he also lists FBI reports sections 1 and 5. FBI reports sections 1 and 5. Section 3 in the FBI report. Check out the papers at the Journal of 9/11 Studies. Also check out the educational material posted by the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Dr. Stephen E. Jones, Revisiting 9/11 2001, Applying the Scientific Method, Journal of 9/11 Studies, May 2007. Siegel's video can be purchased at his website, www.911eyewitness.com, and you can watch that free on YouTube. So now, here is another report about this. In the first ever interview of its kind, Dave Gehery speaks with the police officer responsible for arresting the dancing Israelis on September 11th, 2001, who were caught filming and celebrating while the World Trade Center burned and people died. Sergeant Scott DiCarlo reveals the details of that day, details the Zionist-controlled mainstream media conveniently overlooked. DiCarlo has promised that this is his first and last interview on the subject, in the hopes of quelling ongoing interest in his role that horrible day. The Mossad prides itself on deep infiltration and penetration into every Muslim militant group in the world. Thus, any media-hyped terrorist attack reported by the Zionist-occupied press is doubtless a Mossad operation. All of the Mossad-engineered terrorist attacks benefits the Zionists, since it galvanizes the Western world into making Israel's enemies their own and gives Israel a free hand in dealing with the Palestinians, who are looked upon as enemies of the world. In fact, the Zionist Jew Dov Zakim, along with his Mossad cohorts, should be put on trial for the theft of public funds, treason, and the murder of thousands of innocent victims at the World Trade Center on 9/11/2001. As the Pentagon's controller from 2001 to 2004, Zakim oversaw 3 Department of Defense budgets. A study by the Defense Department Inspector General discovered that not only could the Pentagon not account for the $1 trillion in money spent, but that the U.S. Army somehow lost track of the 56 airplanes, 32 tanks, and 36 Javelin missiles command launch units. How is that the Zionist Jew Dov Zakim, who was on President Bush's payroll, basically, got off scot-free? And where did the money and military equipment end up? I say the money ended up in the hands of the Mossad and the equipment in the hands of the Israeli Defense Force, for they had their man, Zionist Jew Dov Zakim, in the Pentagon. Okay, so let me just move on to something connected to this, and I'm sure you may have heard parts of this story about Larry Silverstein, who was, you know, the owner of the Twin Towers. And this is titled, this was written in January 7th of 2019, and by the presstv.ir. Larry Silverstein and Louis Eisenberg made billions of dollars from the destruction of Twin Towers. Zionist businessmen Larry Silverstein and Louis Eisenberg, who are close friends of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, made billions of dollars from the destruction of the Twin Towers on September 11th, 2001, says Dr. Cameron Barrett, an American academic who has been studying the events of 9/11 since late 2003. Dr. Barrett, a founding member of the scientific panel for the investigation of 9/11, made the remarks in an interview with Press TV and while commenting on the dark overlord's threat of leaking thousands of secret documents related to 9/11. The hacker group has said that the leak will have devastating consequences for the U.S. deep state, that collection of members of permanent employees of the intelligence, security, and diplomatic services who operate independently of changes in the administration, as in essence a permanent government. The group has already released decryption keys for 650 documents. It says are related to the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, but it is just a fraction of the 18,000 secret 9/11 documents, probably stolen from insurers, law firms, and government agencies. The hackers of the Dark Overlord have described the September 11th documents as the 9/11 papers. It's very interesting, I think. The important thing that people need to know about this is why it's important and why there could be anything important in these insurance companies' documents, says Dr. Barrett. We need to go back to 2001 when the World Trade Center complex and especially the 2 towers were creating terrible problems for the Port Authority, which is the city government agency that owned these buildings. The Twin Towers were riddled with asbestos fireproofing, which was illegal, and they were under court order issued in January or early 2001 to remove the asbestos from the towers. This would have cost billions, perhaps double-digit billions of dollars, economically a non-starter, he said. New York had been trying to find a way to demolish the towers for years. They had high vacancy rate and antiquated communication infrastructure, but they could not tear them down because there was no way to do it economically, the analyst said. So, 2 months before 9/11, an alleged organized crime figure named Larry Silverstein got a non-low bid contract from Louis Eisenberg, who was the head of the Port Authority. Both of these guys are very close to Netanyahu. They are hardcore Zionist billionaires, he noted. Silverstein walked out with close to $5 billion in cash. So Silverstein got his contract from the Port Authority, Eisenberg. He bought the entire World Trade Center on a 100-year lease and only put down $15 million with an million of his own money, along with $100 million of his partners, and for that he got the trade center for 100 years, a commentator said. And had the trade center not been demolished, this would have been the worst real estate investment in history, but because Silverstein doubled the insurance money from what the Port Authority had held and managed to get lucky on September 11th, he walked out of this with close to $5 billion in cash, he pointed out. He had negotiated it with the insurance company to give him the cash settlement beforehand. And then he also claimed a double indemnity. That is, he wanted to double the money because he said there were two separate and unrelated terrorist attacks, namely the two alleged airplanes, the researcher said. So he made a tremendous amount of money out of this. And the insurance company lost, or some insurance companies lost. The question is, which insurance companies lost billions of dollars to Larry Silverstein? Louis Eisenberg and the deep state 9/11 insurance fraud crime, which of course was also done for geopolitical reasons, he observed. And maybe we will find some of the answers in these insurance documents, because clearly nobody wanted to be left holding the bag to the tune of billions of dollars of insurance money for an obvious inside job in which those towers, not just the Twin Towers, but also World Trade Center 7 as well, were obviously blown up, taken down in a controlled demolition, he stated. So I'm going to have to stop this video. We'll call this part 1. And I'm going to have to pick up in the next video to continue on with this. I want you to remember what I told you about Jerusalem and her people, written in the Bible, that they are the scarlet harlot that played the harlot against God. And were disobedient to God. They were punished by being scattered throughout all the world. And that's why Mystery Babylon sits on many waters, because she was scattered. And the book of Revelation also says about her that she not only killed the prophets that were sent to her and the saints and the martyrs of Jesus, she stoned those who were sent to her. And Stephen was basically the first Jewish Christian martyr. And, you know, the Sanhedrin were responsible for that death. They also slew Zechariah between the temple and the altar. So when it says in the book of Revelation that she's responsible for souls of men, then you know that she's up to no good. And you know she's trying to elevate herself. Instead of elevating the one who came and died for their sins, which is Jesus Christ of Nazareth, and accepting him as their king, they'll go all around the mulberry bush without acknowledging him. So in the end, God's going to have to deal with his people in the 7-year time of Jacob's trouble. It's not the time for the church. God's taking out from amongst the nations people unto himself as a bride, because his bride didn't want him. So now they're going to have to face the consequences of these actions. And as I said, their whole goal is to become the world's Supreme Court with that Sanhedrin and their king in control. Benjamin Netanyahu is working towards this end. And so I'll see you in the next video. And this is just mind-blowing to think that they are connected to the 9/11 events and that it was all orchestrated. People, we must not be deceived in the last days. We must keep our eyes wide open to the truth. Okay, I'll see you in part 2.